I grew up in a small town in the interior of Ohio, in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other. It was one of those places where Halloween was taken seriously. Every house decorated, people dressed up, children running from one side to the other with buckets full of sweets. I was 12 years old at the time, and I remember well because it was the last year I went out to do trick-or-treat with my two best friends, Tyler and Josh. We lived on the same street and our parents let us go alone that night, as long as we didn't go past the main block. The weather was cool, kind of humid, and the floor still had dry autumn leaves that made noise at every step. The entire street was lit by the decorations, pumpkins with candles inside, fake wets, dolls hanging on the balconies. It was one of those moments when everything seemed safe. We had already been walking for about 2 hours when we decided to take the way back. I remember it was already around 9:30, and most of the houses were starting to turn off the lights on the balcony, the sign that the sweets had run out. That's when we saw him. A man pushing a baby stroller walking very slowly along the sidewalk across the street. The cart was covered with a white sheet, and he wore a kind of generic costume, a dark coat, a simple mask, like those sold in the market. At first we didn't find it strange. It was Halloween after all. But when he crossed the street towards us and stopped right in front of us, we were all silent. He spoke in a low voice, a little muffled by the mask, asking if we wanted special sweets. He said he had done it at home, and that his son, pointing to the cart, had helped him choose. I remember the way he spoke, too paused, and the weird smell that came from the cart, a mixture of damp cloth and something sweet, like old syrup. Tyler laughed and asked if the baby was sleeping, and the man said yes, that he couldn't make noise. I felt a discomfort at the time, as if something was wrong, but I was quiet because I didn't want to look fearful. He reached out with a plastic bag full of candy, and when I looked closer I realized that they were not normal candies. They looked like they were wrapped in film paper, some crumpled, others half melted. Josh whimpered to me that we should leave, but before we moved, the man tilted the stroller a little as if he wanted to show the sleeping baby. But the sheet partially fell off, and you could see that there was no one in there. I remember perfectly the sound of the wheels scraping on the floor when he pulled the cart back and covered it again quickly, as if he didn't want us to see it. My heart began to beat hard, and I felt a cold going up my back. Tyler asked loudly where the baby was, and the man just stood still, staring at us from behind the mask without answering anything. It was at that moment that I knew that something was very wrong. We started walking backwards, half laughing nervously, trying to disguise the fear. The man took a step forward and asked why we were leaving so early, that we still had a lot of house to visit. His voice sounded more tense, more forced. I remember feeling a chill on my arm, as if the air had suddenly gotten colder. Tyler said that our parents were waiting, and then he just shook his head slowly, as if he didn't believe it. The street was almost empty at that point. Most of the families had already left, and everything was silent. You could only hear the dry leaves moving with the wind. When we started to move away, the man pushed the cart forward faster now and said, "You can take it, it's just candy." He said this with a strange tone, almost begging, but without any emotion. I looked at his face and realized that the mask was not made of cheap plastic as I thought. It looked like a thin fabric, like those old hospital masks, only stained, kind of yellowish. The worst thing was that, behind her, you could see the contour of her mouth moving slowly, as if he whispered something to himself. That's when Tyler just turned around and started running, and Josh and I went after him without even looking back. We ran nonstop to the corner, and only when we turned the street that we felt safe enough to look back. The man was still there, standing in the same place, with the cart turned in the direction where we had fled. He didn't try to follow us, but stood there motionless as if he was watching. The lights of the nearby houses flashed because of the decorations, and for a few seconds his face appeared and disappeared into the darkness. I remember the sound of my steps mixed with the noise of my beating heart. It seemed too loud in the silence of that street. When we got close to my house, we were already panting and trying to convince ourselves that he must be just some weird guy in costume. We went straight into the garage, and my mother realized that something was wrong. I made up an excuse, said that a strange man had tried to give us candy, but she thought it was just childish paranoia. But that night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept thinking about that empty cart and the way he reacted when we saw it. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered his voice and the stained mask. Around midnight, I was still awake, and I swear I heard a sound outside, cartwheels passing slowly on the sidewalk right in front of my house. I stood completely still in bed, trying to convince myself that it was something in my head. But the sound continued for a while, that rhythmic noise of old wheels scraping on the concrete. The curtain in my room was ajar, and the orange light on the pole illuminated part of the street. I kept looking at the ceiling with my heart racing, and I thought about calling my parents, but something in me told me not to move. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. The street became silent again, and I finally managed to fall asleep, although with the feeling that someone was still there, standing still, looking at my window. The next morning, the entire neighborhood was commenting that the police had passed earlier, asking about a man with a stroller seen offering sweets. My mother turned pale when she heard that, and made me tell her everything that happened the night before. They warned the neighbors and the school, and we found out that other children had also seen him on different streets, always with the same cart covered by a sheet. We never knew who it was, and the police never arrested anyone. After that Halloween, I never wanted to go out again to ask for candy. To this day, when I hear that sound of wheels dragging on the floor, my whole body freezes. Story 2. I worked the night shift at a convenience station that was at the exit of a road in Indiana. It was one of those small places with only 2 fuel pumps, a tiny snack bar, and a huge glass in front that gave the track. I was 22 years old at the time, and I did that schedule to save money and go back to school. Most of the nights were quiet, just truckers and people returning from parties. But on Halloween that year, the movement was strange. Many people in costumes, some drunk, others just stopping to buy cigarettes or drink. Around 2 in the morning, I was already alone at the counter, trying to scare away sleep with cold coffee when he came in. It was a tall, thin man wearing a simple costume, dark pants, denim jacket, and a white mask that seemed to be handmade. It wasn't a movie or character, it was just a human face mask, smooth, expressionless. He held a bottle of soda and stood still for a while looking at the shelves, but what bothered me was the way he turned to me. I didn't say anything. He just stood there, standing still, with his head slightly tilted, watching me. I tried to start a conversation, asked if he was going to pay in cash or card, and he just put the bottle on the counter without answering. The silence was so strange that I even laughed nervously and asked if he was okay. He then raised his index finger, pointed to the mask as if he wanted to show something, and then simply said, with a low and hoarse voice, "Happy Halloween." The way he spoke without any emotion gave me goosebumps. I passed the quick change and waited for him to leave, but he stood there for a few more seconds, looking directly at me from behind that white mask. It seemed like he was trying to memorize my face. When he finally left, the doorbell sounded, and the noise was the only sound that broke that heavy atmosphere. I took a deep breath and went to the window to make sure he had left. His car was stopped at the pump, but the lights were off. He stayed inside, motionless, for a few minutes, until he started and disappeared on the road. I tried to forget and went back to organizing some boxes behind the counter, but when I looked at the window again, I almost dropped the coffee. The reflection of the mask was still there on the glass, clear, as if he were on the other side watching me. But the parking lot was completely empty. My first thought was that it was just a reflection of some Halloween decoration outside, so I turned off the lights on the counter to see better. But the reflection was still there, exactly in the same place, a white spot in the shape of a face looking straight at me. I stood still for a few seconds trying to understand, and the more I stared, the more it seemed that the mask changed angle, as if following my movement. I felt my whole body get cold. I picked up the phone and called the security guard at the station, who was patrolling at dawn. While I was waiting for him to answer, I heard a dry snash on the other side of the store, coming from the refrigerator area. There was no one. When I returned to the counter, the reflection was no longer in the window. Up close, you could see the contour of the mouth and even the design of the lower edge. I locked the front door and stood behind the counter, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe some customer who leaned his face against the glass before. Even so, I called the manager and asked him to review the security cameras. While I waited, I sat in the chair and stared at the window, feeling that mixture of fear and anger for being alone there. The clock marked almost 3 in the morning when I heard a sound of footsteps outside, very close to the fuel pump. I got up slowly and looked through the side of the curtain. There was no one, only the reflection of the flashing lights. Even so, I swear I heard the sound of something being dragged on the asphalt like wet shoes. The security guard arrived about 10 minutes later. When I told him what had happened, he took a walk around the gas station and came back saying that he hadn't seen anyone, but that he had recent footprints on the clay behind the building. I went out with him to look, and there they were, boot marks going to the back wall and returning to the road. Near the marks, half buried in the mud, there was a mask identical to that of the man in the store. The material looked like thick paper, with paint peeling and the inside all dirty as if it had been used for a long time. The security guard took him inside and locked him in the office until the police arrived. The police showed up shortly after dawn. 2 officers came in, looked at the cameras, and spent a while reviewing the images with me. The man really shows up entering the store, but the strangest thing is what comes next. You can see him leaving, going towards the car, and then simply disappearing from the picture before even opening the door. No other angle shows him leaving. The car is stopped there for a few seconds and then leaves by itself, or at least it seems. The officers did not comment much. They only said that they would do a scan in the region and that the case would be investigated as an attempt at intimidation. I was released to go home, but I couldn't sleep the rest of the day. I kept thinking about that mask thrown behind the post, the footprint stopping very close to the window, and the reflection I saw even when there was no one outside. I went back to work a few days later, but I never did the dawn shift again. Sometimes when I pass by that glass, you can still see a slight mark, as if the face had been printed there somehow. They have cleaned the glass dozens of times, but it always reappears when the store lights are off. Story 3. At that time I was 19 years old and lived in a small town in the countryside of Illinois, where not much happened other than parties on farms or remote houses. It was Halloween, and a college friend sent me the address of a party that, according to him, everyone was going to be. I had been working all day and almost gave up on going, but I ended up taking the car and driving to the place around 10 at night. It was a long road, full of curves and with few lights, one of those where the GPS is losing signal all the time. When I finally arrived at the marked point, there was an old house large with an illuminated balcony and several people in costume in front. I thought it was right there. The music was low, but you could see colored lights flashing inside the house and some figures on the balcony, all looking at me. I parked the car on the side of the road and walked to the gate, waving to a guy dressed as a vampire who seemed to be the host. He didn't answer. He just stood still, watching me. I thought it was part of the joke, people trying to be scaly in the night weather. When I got closer, I realized that everyone on the balcony was motionless, facing me, but no one said anything. Some masks were so realistic that you could see the eyes from behind, fixed on me without blinking. I tried to break the mood by saying something like "beautiful party" and asking if Mark, my friend, had already arrived. No one answered. I laughed, kind of dull, and climbed the first step of the balcony. The wooden floor creaked, and you could hear a muffled sound coming from inside like a radio tuned to the wrong station. People kept standing still, and the more I looked, the more it seemed that the faces were wrong. Some had blurred paint, others seemed to wear crooked masks with holes where the eyes should be. Still, the warm lighting on the balcony gave an almost normal tone to the scene, and I tried to convince myself that it was just drunk people playing. A woman dressed as a bride with her dress all dirty with red paint turned her head slowly to face me. I felt a tightness in my chest. I asked if that was Jessica's party just to confirm the address, and she shook her head slightly, but in a strange way, as if she didn't understand the question. Behind her, a man with a skull mask began to go down the steps, walking slowly until he stopped about 2 meters from me. I took a step back and tried to laugh again, but my throat dried up. None of them said anything. They just approached silently, one by one, as if they wanted to surround me. My instinct screamed for me to get out of there, so I muttered "I'm sorry, I think I got the address wrong," and started walking on my back, going down the steps. They kept looking at me, all motionless again, and the silence became heavy. When I got close to the gate, I heard the sound of the front door opening behind them. A stronger light came out from inside, revealing several people standing in the corridor, all with different costumes, but with the same fixed look. No sound, no laughter, nothing. I turned around for good and started walking fast to the car. The sound of my footsteps in the gravel echoed loudly, and that's when I noticed other steps behind me. Light, synchronized, as if trying not to make noise. When I looked over my shoulder, I saw 3 of them coming towards me, walking with that same strange rhythm. The fantasies flittered with the wind, and every second they seemed closer. I even tripped trying to open the car door. My fingers were shaking so much that I dropped the key on the floor. I took it back and went in, locking everything at once. The lighthouse lit the road, and for a moment, I thought they were going to retreat. But no, they stopped a few meters from the car, lined up, looking straight at me. The guy with the skull mask took a step forward and raised his hand, as if asking me to lower the glass. I started and left, speeding without looking back. I drove for about 5 minutes trying to find the cell phone signal to warn Mark. When I finally got it, he answered laughing and said that the party hadn't even started yet, that the people were arriving at that moment, in a completely different house, about 10 minutes away. I was silent for a while, trying to understand what had happened. I told him what I saw, but he thought I was exaggerating, that I probably stopped at the wrong house of some group playing Halloween games. Even so, he sent the exact location and asked me to go back there with him and 2 other friends to see what it was. I accepted, a little reluctant, just to prove that I wasn't making it up. When we came back, it didn't even take 15 minutes, but the house looked like another one. The balcony, which was previously all lit, was now completely off. No light on, no music, no decoration. The place was in total silence, and Mark's car lit up the tall bush that covered part of the backyard. We knocked on the door a few times and no one answered. One of my friends jokingly said to look out the window. When I brought my face closer to the glass, I saw only an empty room, without furniture, dust everywhere, and a thin layer of wets on the ceiling. It seemed abandoned for years. We were silent for a while, trying to understand if it was really the right place. I walked to the point where I had parked before. You could still see the recent tire marks on the gravel, exactly where my car had been. That gave me goosebumps. The house was clearly empty, but I had been there less than 20 minutes before and saw people, lights, music, everything. Mark began to say that maybe I had stopped on another road, but I remembered perfectly the gate, the wooden fence, and the fallen tree near the entrance. Everything was beating. What didn't make sense was the state of the house now. It seemed dead, with no sign of life. While we were arguing, his friend Ryan pointed to the side of the balcony. In the middle of the woods, one of the wooden steps was broken, and you could see a deep footprint on the earth, still wet. It seemed recent. We stood there looking at that, and for a second I had the impression of seeing something moving inside. Very fast, like a shadow passing in the direction of the corridor. Mark laughed nervously and told us to leave before someone showed up thinking we were breaking into private property. No one disagreed. We got in the car and went straight to the right party, but I could barely enjoy the rest of the night. The rest of the night was a blur for me. While everyone was having fun, I could only think about that house. The road back passed very close to her, and when I returned home in the morning, I decided to check once again, this time with daylight. I parked a little ahead and went down to look. It was the same gate, the same fallen tree, but the house looked even older than the night before. The windows were all broken, the ceiling sunk, and the bush covered half of the balcony. There was no sign of anyone living there for a long time. I asked the neighbors of a nearby farm if anyone lived in that house. An older man replied that she had been abandoned since the owner died almost 10 years ago, and that sometimes young people went there to play games or Halloween challenges, but no one stayed for long. I told him what I saw, and he just looked at me with a strange expression, saying that every year someone appeared with the same story. After that day, I never went back to that road at night. And to this day, when I pass by, I have the feeling that someone is still watching me from the dark balcony of that house. Story 4. I've been living alone for a few years in a quiet neighborhood of Nashville. My house is small, with a simple balcony and one of those security cameras with a motion sensor pointing to the street. I've always felt safe there, especially because my neighbors are all elderly and the neighborhood is very quiet. On Halloween, I usually put some decorations in front of the house, but that year I didn't even get very excited. I only left a pumpkin and some orange lights. When the date passed, I put everything away and went back to normal routine. A few days later, on a Wednesday morning, I woke up with a slight noise like something hitting the wood of the balcony. I looked at the clock. It was 3:07 a.m. At first I thought it was the wind, but the sound seemed rhythmic, like something being put on the ground. I lay down, trying to ignore it, until I heard a dry snat, as if someone had stepped on the step. My whole body became tense. I took the phone, opened the camera app, and played the real-time recording. But the image was too dark to see anything. I waited a few seconds until the sensor turned on the external light, and that's when I saw, right in the middle of the balcony, a carved pumpkin with a lit candle inside. At first I thought it was some late Halloween joke. Maybe some neighbor trying to scare me or some bored child. But when I zoomed in on the image, I noticed something that made me freeze. There was a paper inside the pumpkin, stuck on the edge, with my name written in capital letters. Julia. The worst thing was that the candle was still burning, the flame shaking with the wind as if it had been lit a short time ago. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing, until the candle flashed and the video crashed for a moment. When he returned, the flame was still lit, but it seemed weaker. I got out of bed and went to the bedroom window, from where you could see part of the balcony. The light from the pole illuminated only the handrail, and the rest was in twilight. You could still see that weak orange glow inside the pumpkin. I picked up the phone to call a friend, but I stopped halfway. I felt ashamed to look paranoid, so I decided to just check what it was and put out the candle. I put on a sweatshirt, took a flashlight, and went to the front door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The air outside was cold, and the silence of the street made everything look stranger than it really was. When I opened the door, I smelled the strong smell of burnt wax mixed with something sweet, perhaps from the inside of the pumpkin itself. The flame was still shaking, casting shadows on the balcony walls. I crouched slowly and saw the note stuck with a toothpick. It was a torn notebook sheet with my name written in black pen, tremblingly, as if the person was in a hurry or was writing in the dark. Nothing more than that. No message, no symbol, just my name. That left me with a horrible feeling, as if someone had been there watching me while I slept. I took the pumpkin from the sides and took it to the corner of the balcony, planning to blow out the candle and throw everything away in the morning. That's when I heard a snap coming from the gate. I stopped immediately. It was the same sound as before, that light creak of metal moving. I was completely motionless with the flashlight pointed at the street, but I didn't see anyone. The wind was still, and the only thing that moved was the flame of the sail, oscillating fast as if reacting to the movement. I waited a few seconds and went back inside, locking the door and checking the padlock twice before going up to the room. Back in the room, I went straight to check the cameras to see if anyone had appeared in the recording. I turned the video for about 10 minutes, and there it was. A man slowly approaching my balcony. He wore a hoodie and held something in his arms, the pumpkin. The video was in black and white, but you could see it clearly when he crouched down and lit the candle. Then he stood still for a few seconds, looking in the direction of the door, completely motionless. What left me breathless was the moment he raised his face and looked directly at the camera. The hood covered almost everything, but you could see the contour of a smile before he turned around and walked away calmly. I watched the recording about 10 times, trying to understand if it was someone I knew, but I couldn't recognize anything. The way he moved was strange, unhurried, as if he knew I would only see that later. I went back to the recording a few more seconds and saw that he appeared in the video exactly at 3 a.m. sharp. It gave me goosebumps, because I had woken up minutes after hearing the first sound. It was as if he had waited for the right moment to leave it there. I sent the video to a friend who works with security, and he advised me to call the police immediately. The police arrived around 4 in the morning. 2 officers came to the balcony, looked at the pumpkin, and collected the ticket for analysis. They asked if I had fought with someone recently or if there was any neighbor who might have a reason to intimidate me. I said no, that my life was very quiet and that I barely knew the people on the street. They asked to see the complete recordings of the cameras, and while one of the officers watched, the other stood outside examining the backyard. When he returned, he said that there were footprints on the grass going from the gate to the balcony and then back to the sidewalk. The footprints were big and deep, probably from a man. One of the policemen commented that it was probably just a bad joke, common at that time of year. But I could see that he himself didn't believe much about it. They took the video and the ticket and told me to keep the doors locked and call in case it happened again. When the sun rose, the candle was still burning inside the pumpkin, or at least it seemed. When I got closer, I realized that the flame had melted almost nothing of the wax, as if it had been lit a few minutes ago, even after hours there. I threw everything away, including the pumpkin, but the sweet smell of burnt wax stayed on the balcony the rest of the day. That night I tried to sleep earlier, but sleep just didn't come. To each noise, my body reacted with a start. I was watching through the camera in real time, even though I knew it was unlikely that the man would come back so quickly. Around 3 a.m. again, the motion sensor turned on, and my heart almost stopped. I ran to look at the cell phone, but the image showed only the wind swinging the branches of the tree in front. Still, the balcony light kept flashing as if there was something moving out of range of the camera. I turned off the screen and tried to take a deep breath, but the feeling that someone was there, standing still, was unbearable. In the following days, nothing else happened. The police contacted saying that the footprints disappeared with the rain and that the ticket had no fingerprints. They said that, without more evidence, they couldn't do much. I tried to follow life, but I began to notice small details. A flashlight that disappeared from the balcony. The trash can moved from place. And one night, the sound of slow steps in the backyard gravel. When I went to check through the camera, the video was completely black, as if someone had covered the lens. Since then, I leave all the lights on and sleep with the phone in my hand. I never found another pumpkin, but I still wake up almost always exactly at 3 in the morning. Story 5. I was 17 years old and lived with my parents in a quiet suburb of Kentucky, where everyone decorated the houses on Halloween. I always took it more seriously than the rest of the neighborhood. It was the only one who made a complete scenario, with lights, smoke, skeletons, and even soundtrack playing from the garage. That year, I assembled everything by myself, and I was proud of the result. The whole street seemed to like my decorations, except the guy from the front house. He was new in the neighborhood. He must have been in his early 40s, lived alone, and almost never talked to anyone. We saw him from time to time in the backyard, smoking or looking at nothing. On Halloween night, I stayed outside until late, checking if everything was working properly. The sound of laughter and footsteps of the children was decreasing as the night progressed, and around 10, the neighborhood began to get quieter. I sat on the balcony stairs looking at the lawn illuminated by orange lights when I noticed the neighbor standing across the street. He was there in the middle of the sidewalk, motionless, looking straight at my backyard. I thought maybe he was just admiring the decorations, but the way he stood still without moving began to make me uncomfortable. I watched for a few minutes, waiting for him to wave or say something, but nothing. He just stayed there, completely motionless, with his hands in his pockets and his face partially covered by the shade of the tree. The pole light flashed from time to time, and in those intervals you could see his eyes fixed on me. I tried to act naturally. I got up, turned off the smoke machine, and started collecting some things, but he didn't look away even for a second. When I looked again, I realized that he was closer to the sidewalk, almost on the side of the street. He seemed to have taken a few steps forward without me noticing. I stood there, standing still, trying to pretend it didn't bother me. I turned on my cell phone to look busy, but my reflection on the screen clearly showed his figure back there, motionless. About 10 minutes passed until he finally turned around and entered the house without haste. I waited a little longer and closed the gate, trying to convince myself that I was just tired. Before entering, I looked one last time at his house. The lights were all off, but you could see a curtain moving upstairs, as if someone was spying. I went in and locked the door, still with that strange feeling stuck to me. My parents were already sleeping, so I went straight to my room, which was facing the street. The pole light illuminated part of the window, and out of pure curiosity, I opened the curtain a little to look. The neighbor's house was completely dark, but something there made me stop. In the upstairs window, the same as before, there seemed to be a silhouette. You couldn't see the face, only the outline of someone leaning against the glass, motionless, looking here. I closed the curtain at once and lay down, trying to ignore it. You could still hear the sound of the lights and decorations turning off outside, which in a way made me calmer. I woke up in the middle of the night with a dry noise coming from the backyard like something falling. I looked at the clock. It was 3:12 a.m. I was silent for a while, trying to hear better. Another sound came soon after, a snap as if something had been dragged. I took my cell phone and opened the camera app that is in front of the house. The image showed the entire backyard, but with so much interference that it seemed that the lens was wet. Still, you could see the decorations moving, as if the wind was strong, but the rest of the street was completely stopped. I brought the brightness of the screen closer to my face and froze when I noticed a shadow passing slowly between the decorations. It was a human figure, walking barefoot on the lawn, stopping in front of the dolls and knocking them down one by one. What really made me freeze was seeing that the person was coming from the side of the neighbor's house, crossing straight to my sidewalk. The video was kind of granular, but you could see the heavy way of walking and the weak reflection of the lights flashing on the ankles. He really didn't wear shoes. My first impulse was to go down and scream, but my body didn't react. I just watched while he finished trampling the last ornament and disappeared in the corner of the camera. I waited a few minutes until I had the courage to look out the window. The backyard lights were off and the cold wind made the torn plastic of the decorations hit the floor. I couldn't see anyone, but the footprints were there, marked on the wet grass, sharp impressions of bare feet crossing the lawn to the gate. And on the sidewalk, turned in the opposite direction, other footprints following in a straight line to the neighbor's house. I closed the curtains and stayed awake until dawn, listening to every sound, every snap, as if something was still moving outside. As soon as the sun rose, I went down to the backyard to see the damage. The decorations were all destroyed. The broken skeleton, the torn wets, and the scarecrow that I had made myself thrown face down on the ground. The footprints were lighter in daylight, big adult feet, and you could see the texture of the dry clay on the edges, as if the person had come from some muddy terrain. I followed the trail to the gate, and from there you could see the same marks crossing the street in a straight line to the entrance of the neighbor's house. The strangest thing is that there was only a set of footprints going in his direction. No sign of return. I waited until about 9 in the morning to go there. I rang the bell twice, but no one answered. The curtains were all closed and no sound came out of the inside. One of the oldest neighbors showed up and asked what I was doing there. When I told her, she frowned and said she thought the man had moved weeks ago, that the moving truck had passed a few days before Halloween. I didn't know what to answer. I said I saw him the night before, but she just shook her head and said it must have been someone joking. I went home trying to convince myself of this, but I still remember his expression watching me, motionless, for a whole 10 minutes. Story 6. I lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, and that Halloween night me and my 2 friends, Megan and Riley, had gone to a party at a schoolmate's house. It was one of those typical suburban parties, full of loud music, colorful lights, and 2 costumed people for an improvised event. We stayed there until around midnight, and since we were sober and lived nearby, we decided to drive back. I drove my silver sedan, and the way to my house took about 20 minutes, passing through residential streets almost without movement at that time. The air was cold, and the sound of the tires on the wet asphalt seemed to be the only noise when we entered the main street. That's where Megan first noticed. A black car appeared behind us with the headlights low and always keeping the same distance. At first we didn't care. It was an ordinary street. It could be anyone coming home. But as we turned into other roads, the car kept coming, repeating exactly the same curves. At every corner I looked through the rearview mirror, and he was there, fixed, without trying to overtake, just following. Riley suggested that maybe we were imagining something, but the tone of her voice betrayed that she was also getting tense. I slowed down, then accelerated, and the car kept the pace, always at the same point. After a few minutes, the weather inside the car became heavy. No one said anything, only the sound of the windshield wiper and the accelerated breathing of each one. I decided to test it for good. I entered a dead-end street near the school, waiting for him to pass straight. But no. The black car turned behind us, stopped a few meters away, and stayed there, with the engine on and the headlights now much stronger. The light hit the mirror and blinded me for a second. Megan started to panic, telling me to reverse and get out of there as soon as possible. I did this without thinking, maneuvering with difficulty until I returned to the main street. As soon as I accelerated, the car did the same and started to follow again. That feeling of being hunted is hard to describe. I felt a chill in my stomach and my hands were so sweaty that they barely held the steering wheel. We tried to call the police, but the cell phone signal failed all the time in that region. That's when Riley had the idea of going to the gas station near the highway. It was the only well-lit place in that area, and there were always people there, even at dawn. I turned to the nearest avenue and accelerated, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror all the time. The car was still there, but now further away, as if it were waiting. When we finally arrived at the station, the heart felt like it was going to come out of the chest. I parked right in front of the convenience store, under the strongest lights. The place was almost empty, only an employee inside and a car refueling at the pump on the other side. The black car came coming down the avenue, and for a second, I thought it would stop too. But no. He slowed down, passed slowly in front of the station, and then accelerated, disappearing at the next intersection. We stood there looking at each other, not knowing what to do. I was shaking, trying to take a deep breath, and Megan insisted that we stay a while longer until we were sure the car wouldn't come back. We stayed there for almost half an hour. I bought a bottle of water and asked the attendant if he had noticed a black car circulating around there. He said no, and commented that many people were terrified that night, thinking they were being followed. Halloween thing, according to him. But none of that seemed like a coincidence. When I felt calmer, I decided to take each one home. First I left Riley, then Megan, and finally I went to my street, still looking at the mirrors on every corner. The path was completely empty, the kind of silence that seems to stick to the skin. When I parked in front of my house, the clock marked 2:47 a.m. The neighborhood lights were off and only the pole at the end of the street blinked from time to time. I stayed inside the car for a while, trying to decide if I should leave or wait a little longer. I ended up going down and going straight to the door, still with my heart racing. As soon as I entered, I locked everything and went to the living room window, from where you could see part of the street. It was empty. The feeling of relief was immediate, but the body was still shaking as if waiting for something to happen. I had a glass of water and sat on the couch, repeating to myself that everything was fine, that it must have been a coincidence. But around 3:15, I heard the sound of an engine outside, weak but unmistakable. I went to the window and for a second I thought I was imagining. The black car was parked right in front of my house with the headlights off. The whole street was dark, so the shape of the vehicle could only be seen when the pole light flashed. I stood there, holding the curtain, trying to see if there was anyone inside. I couldn't see any face, just a whitish glow on the windshield as if someone was watching me. The engine was still on, in a low and constant rumble. My whole body got stuck. I wanted to call the police, but the phone was in the kitchen and any movement could report that I was looking. I kept watching, trying to understand what the person wanted. After a few minutes, the car began to move slowly, advancing a few meters until it stopped again, a little closer to my entrance. I could see the steam from the exhaust coming out in short clouds because of the cold, and that only made everything more real. The street was completely deserted, and no neighbor seemed awake. I decided to take the cell phone slowly and shoot through the curtain crack, just to have some proof. I recorded it for about 40 seconds. The car didn't move. When the pole light flashed again, the reflection on the glass seemed different. For a moment, I was sure I saw someone turn their face in the direction of my window. That was enough. I moved away from the curtain, locking all the doors again, and went to the room with my cell phone in my hand. I called 911, trying to keep my voice steady, explained what was happening, and asked them to send a car. While I was talking, I heard the sound of the engine increasing and then silence. I looked through the bedroom window and the car was no longer there. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers examined the street and said there were no cars nearby. I showed the video and one of them confirmed that it really looked like a black sedan, with no visible plate, probably with the record covered. They made a round around and came back saying they didn't find anything suspicious. One of the policemen advised me to install more cameras and leave the external lights on at night. I nodded, but inside I knew it wasn't paranoia. That car had followed me, and someone knew exactly where I lived. After they left, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed until dawn, looking out the window every few minutes. The neighborhood was waking up little by little, the neighbors leaving for work, and only then could I breathe properly. I spent the whole day reviewing the video, trying to understand if there was any detail that I had missed. In one of the paintings, almost at the end of the recording, when the car accelerates, you can see a small sticker on the windshield, a white skull. It was the same sticker I had seen on the back of the car that followed us since the party. I showed the video to my father when he got home from work, and he was silent for a while, watching that excerpt repeatedly. He said that maybe it was a coincidence, but you could see that he didn't believe it very much either. At night, he installed the camera facing the street and assured me that if the car came back, we would see everything. I spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it, but every time the sun went down, the nervousness came back. At 10:30, I was still awake, listening to the distant sound of cars on the avenue, when I noticed the front lights reflecting on something metallic across the street. My heart raced. I looked out the window and saw the black car parked again at the same point as the night before. No movement, no lights on, only the dark contour under the pole. I called my father, and when we went back together to the window, the car was simply no longer there. It was fast, as if it had disappeared in seconds. We went outside to check, but the street was completely empty, and on the floor, right in the middle of the sidewalk, there were fresh tire marks, still wet. My father said we should leave the cameras recording all night. When we saw the filming the next day, the car appeared stopped for almost an hour, and disappeared without the engine sound being picked up. Story 7. On that Halloween, the whole neighborhood seemed to come out of a movie. Costumed children running along the sidewalks, music from afar, laughter, and the constant sound of candy bags being shaken. I was accompanying my son Noah and 2 other street boys, walking between the houses and taking pictures of the costumes. It was around 9 o'clock at night. The air was already starting to get cold, and the orange lights of the decorations gave the street that cozy glow typical of that time. We were already returning home when Noah pointed to a corner, where there was a man standing dressed in a white sheet that covered his entire body, up to his feet. He held a big bag, one of those top bags which seemed full. At first I thought it was just someone dressed as a ghost playing with the children, but something in the way he stood still drew attention. He didn't say anything. He just waited. When we approached, he raised his arm slowly and offered candy to the children, taking them from the bag with the other hand. The voice was muffled, low, difficult to understand, and he repeated the same words. "You can take it. It's for everyone." The children hesitated, and I approached to see better. That's when I realized that the bag didn't seem full of candy. The shape was irregular, heavy, and the way he held it looked more like someone carrying real weight. I asked where he was from, trying to start a conversation, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, still, the sheet moving slightly with the wind. The children began to whist, and one of them asked if he was dressed as a ghost. No reaction. I bent down a little to look under the fabric, but he took a step back fast, as if he didn't want to be seen. It was at that moment that I realized something strange. His shoes were completely dirty with clay, and the surrounding floor had marks of wet footprints that came from the end of the street, a stretch that led directly to a bush area. Without houses, that made me uncomfortable. I called the children to get away a little, and a mother who came from the other side of the street approached, asking if everything was okay. I said yes, but that the guy was being weird. She, more direct than me, went to him and asked loudly, "Can I see what's inside this bag?" The man stood still for a few seconds, and then something changed in his posture. The body became tense, stiff. He lowered his head a little, pressed the bag against his chest, and without saying anything, suddenly turned around and started running. First walking fast, then shooting, crossing the street and disappearing in the darkness of the bush as if he already knew where to go. The children started screaming, some laughing, thinking it was part of the game, but me and the other adults stood still, trying to understand what had just happened. The sound of his footsteps echoed on the wet floor, that noise of soaked shoe hitting the asphalt until it disappeared completely into the darkness. I went to the entrance of the bush, illuminating with the cell phone flashlight, but I couldn't see anything but the trees and the thin fog that formed there. The bag he carried seemed heavy, and there was no way anyone could run so fast with it. Still, he disappeared as if he had broken apart in the middle of the pitch. We went back to the street, and the children started commenting that he must be scaring. One of the parents called the police, more as a precaution than out of real fear. When the car arrived, the officers asked if anyone had been able to see his face. Nobody. The sheet covered everything, and the voice, when he spoke, was muffled, as if it came from behind a mask. They entered with the lanterns in the thicket, stayed there for about 20 minutes, and came back saying they didn't find anyone. Only barefoot footprint marks in the clay, going deeper and deeper into the forest, until they disappeared completely. The police said it was probably just some teenager trying to scare the children, but no one there believed it very much. The footprints were too big, as an adult, and started in the middle of the road, as if he had appeared there, out of nowhere. I spent more time watching, trying to understand how he managed to disappear so quickly. One of the mothers commented that she thought she had seen that same man earlier, standing on the corner, watching the decorated houses, but doing nothing. This left me with a chill that didn't go away for the rest of the night. We returned home all together, each one making sure that the doors were locked before saying goodbye. Later, already lying down, I decided to look at the camera images of the doorbell that overlooked the street. I wanted to see if he had been there before. Around 8:50 a.m., the video showed the man walking slowly along the curb, holding the bag the same way. He stopped in front of the houses for a few seconds, looked, and followed. When he arrived at mine, he stood still for a longer time, motionless, facing the gate. The camera captured the subtle movement of the swinging sheet, and something in the way he tilted his head made me completely cold. He stayed there for almost a whole minute before moving away and disappearing from the frame. The next morning, I went out to see if I could find any sign of him or that bag. The street was still humid and the smell of wet earth was strong. Soon I realized that the footprints were still there, going from the middle of the street to the sidewalk of my house and then moving away towards the thicket again. The marks were very clear, and what caught my attention was that there were no footprints coming back, just going. It was as if he had come, stopped in front of the houses, and then disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a few minutes trying to understand if it was possible for someone to be playing at this point, walking barefoot at that temperature. Around 10 o'clock, the police came back to talk to us. One of them said they found the bag in the middle of the thicket, torn and dirty with mud. Inside there were remains of sweets, crumpled papers, and some empty packages, nothing too much. But what bothered me was the way the officer spoke, fast, without looking into the eyes, as if he wanted to close the matter right away. Before leaving, he commented that they had already received other similar reports in that region, all involving a man covered by a white sheet, offering sweets after hours. Since that night, I never let Noah go out alone on Halloween.
And to this day, when I see a sheet swinging on the clothesline at night.
Story 8. I live alone in a ground-floor apartment on the outskirts of Milwaukee. It's a small but quiet place, and I like the silence of the neighborhood. Even on Halloween, when the street is usually full of costumed children, nothing too much ever happens. That year I hadn't memorized anything. I just left the balcony light on for those who came to ask for candy. Around 11 p.m., when the movement was already over, I heard 3 slow knocks on the door. They weren't light, but they didn't seem urgent either, as if someone was testing to see if I was still awake. I thought it was some teenager playing tricks, so I went to the door and looked through the peephole. The balcony was empty. I waited a few seconds, hearing only the sound of the fine rain falling in the backyard. I decided to open it anyway, and soon I realized something strange. Hanging on the doorknob outside, there was a clown mask. One of those old ones, thick rubber, with a cracked face and an exaggerated smile painted red. I didn't understand at the time. I just kept looking at that, trying to remember if any neighbor was dressed as a clown that night. Around 11:30 p.m., I kept standing there, trying to decide what to do with that mask. I ended up taking a garbage bag and throwing it inside without thinking too much. The smell of the old rubber stayed in my hand, and it gave me a bad feeling, as if I had touched something I shouldn't. I threw the bag in the container outside and went back inside, trying to laugh at the situation. I spent the rest of the night on the couch watching TV with the sound low, but all the time I looked at the door, wondering if anyone was still there. When I finally went to sleep, it was already past midnight. The next morning, everything seemed normal. I left for work, the garbage had been collected, and the day went on quiet. I only remembered the mask at night when I got home and saw a dark spot near the door, on the concrete. I thought it was rain dirt, but the shape was rounded, almost as if something had been hanging there and drained with the water. I ignored it and went in. It was only the next day, after 10 at night, that it happened again. It was raining hard, and while I was making coffee, I heard the same sound of slow knocks on the door. 3 times, the same rhythm as the night before. I went to the door with my heart beating faster with each step. I waited a few seconds before looking through the peephole, and again, there was no one. Only the empty street, wet by the rain, and the distant sound of thunder. I opened it slowly, and there it was, the same clown mask hanging on the doorknob, now completely soaked. The water flowed through the false chin of the mask and dripped on the floor, forming a small puddle. The red smile seemed more distorted this time, as if the paint had flowed with the rain. I stood still looking for a while, unable to understand how it had come back. I got a new garbage bag, but this time I used a cloth so as not to touch it. When I put the mask inside, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The inside was hot, as if it had been used a little while ago. That gave me a chill down my spine. I threw it away again in the same container and checked the cameras in the building, but the ground floor system had been turned off for days for maintenance. No record, no explanation. I locked everything and stayed on the couch with the lights on, listening to the rain hitting the windows and trying not to look at the door. Around 2 in the morning, I was still awake, trying to distract myself with anything on the TV, when I heard the sound of something knocking lightly against the door. This time they weren't beaten. It was as if someone touched and dragged his fingers through the metal from top to bottom in a slow movement. The sound made me freeze. I took the cell phone and stood still, without making a sound, trying to record. It lasted about 10 seconds and then suddenly stopped, leaving only the sound of the rain. I waited a while before looking through the peephole, but the balcony was completely dark. Only the pole lamp flashing from time to time illuminated the contour of the sidewalk. The next morning, before leaving for work, I instinctively looked at the doorknob. This time there was no mask, but the paint around the lock was scratched, as if someone had tried to force it. I called the syndic to report, and he said that no one else in the building had noticed anything. When I got home at night, the garbage had already been collected again, but I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The container where I had thrown the masks was empty, completely clean, no bags, no waste, as if no one had put anything there. And the garbage bag I used, the big black one in the kitchen, was no longer among the ones I had kept. That started to make me really nervous. I spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, and around 11, when the building was silent, I decided to check the external street cameras, which are available in a condominium application. I rolled the recordings until the night before, and around 10:59 p.m., the system captured a silhouette crossing the sidewalk towards my building. The figure wore something that looked like a dark cape or a long coat, and in his right hand he held a white bag, big enough to fit a mask. He stopped right in front of my door, stood there for almost a minute, and then bent down as if hanging something on the doorknob. Then he walked out calmly, without running, disappearing in the corner of the screen. I paused the video several times trying to see the face, but the hood covered everything. What scared me the most was the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, without hesitation, as if he knew exactly where he was going. I closed the laptop and started pushing a dresser against the door just to be sure. I couldn't sleep well. And even without beats that night, I had the feeling that someone was outside, standing still, watching. The next morning, I opened the door very slowly and almost dropped the coffee from my hands. The mask was again hanging on the handle, dry, clean, and with a small tear in the corner of the mouth, as if it had been pulled hard. My whole body got cold. The street was empty, and the newborn sun made the mask even stranger. That cracked smile seemed to look straight at me. I took a bag and removed it without touching it directly, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped it. Instead of throwing it away, I decided to take it inside and put it on the table, to take a picture and show it to the police. While I was fixing, I noticed something that made me stop. There was a small paper stuck with tape inside the mask, folded in 4. I opened it carefully and saw only one word written in a red pen. Back. The heart started to race. I took pictures, called the police department, and asked someone to come immediately. When the officers arrived, I took them to the table, but the mask was no longer there. I searched the kitchen, the floor, even inside the bag, and nothing. They searched the whole apartment and said that maybe I had left it on the balcony and the wind had taken it, but I knew it wasn't. I had put it on the table, and in a matter of minutes it just disappeared. The police wrote down the report, asked me to keep the cameras on, and left. After they left, I sat on the couch trying to process everything. The feeling of being watched was constant, as if someone was standing behind the door, listening to my every move. I left the TV on just because of the noise and stared at the door for long minutes, without the courage to go there. When sleep finally began to win, I heard a light sound coming from the corridor, something like fabric being dragged on the floor. I took my cell phone, opened the camera, and walked slowly to the door. I looked through the peephole and saw only the empty corridor, but there was a shadow projecting on the floor, very close to my door, motionless. I stared for almost a minute until the shadow began to move, slowly moving away. The sound of footsteps was almost inaudible, dragged. I waited a few more seconds before opening the door. The corridor was deserted, only the distant noise of the elevator and the echo of the rain that started outside. I went back inside, and when I closed the door, I noticed something hanging on the inner handle. The mask, the same, dry, clean, with the same tear in the mouth, now inside my apartment. Story 9. I live alone in a small apartment in Portland on the 2nd floor of an old building. I work late in a coffee shop downtown, and I usually get home around 10:30 at night. That Thursday, Halloween had just passed and the weather was still with that smell of rain and dry leaves. I went up the stairs tired, just thinking about taking a shower and sleeping. As soon as I opened the door, I felt a familiar sweet smell, the strong aroma of pumpkin candle, that kind of perfume that stays in the air even after being extinguished. At the time, I thought it was strange because I hadn't turned on any for weeks. I locked the door behind me and left the bag on the couch. The smell seemed to come from the room, dense, hot, as if the candle had just been lit. I turned on the light and stopped. On the coffee table, there was a lit candle, exactly like the ones I used to buy at the time of Halloween. The flame trembled gently, and the melted wax flowed through the glass, still bubbling. I stared for a few seconds, trying to remember if, by chance, I wouldn't have turned it on before leaving. But it was impossible. I had deleted everything before going to work, as always. The wick was partially worn and the glass too hot to have stayed there all day. I went to the kitchen to see if anyone could have come in. The windows were all locked and nothing seemed out of place. The only light came from that orange flame in the room, reflecting on the walls and leaving the environment strange, almost suffocating. I took a cloth and extinguished the candle, but the smell was still strong, too sweet, as if it were impregnated in the air. I went to the room, checked the closet, the bathroom, under the bed, everything normal. Even so, the feeling that someone had been there was impossible to ignore. The air seemed hotter than usual, and the window glass was blurred inside, as if there was recent steam. I picked up the phone and called my friend Zoe, who lives in the same building, just to talk and try to distract her head. I told her what happened and she laughed, saying that I had probably lit the candle and forgotten. I wanted to believe it, but I knew it wasn't the case. While talking to her, I heard a crack in the room as if something glass had cracked. I went there with the cell phone in my hand, using the flashlight, and saw that the candle pot was cracked, a thin line crossing the glass from top to bottom. And the strangest thing, the wick still released smoke as if it had been rekindled and extinguished again. At this point, I started to get really scared. I went to the front door and checked the lock. It was locked, the bolt firm, no sign of burglary. I looked through the peephole. The corridor was empty, only the noise of the building's heater echoing. I went back to the living room and stared at the cracked glass of the candle, trying to understand how that could have happened. I took the pot with a cloth and realized that it was still hot, hot enough to make me release quickly. The wick, completely black, released a thread of thin smoke rising to the ceiling. And the smell? The smell of caramelized pumpkin and cinnamon was stronger than ever, as if someone had spilled essence around the house. I opened the windows trying to dispel the smell, and a cold wind came in, extinguishing the rest of the smoke. Only then did I realize something new. On the bookshelf next to the sofa, there were small round marks on the dust, as if someone had put an object there and removed it a short time ago. I approached and saw a clean circle, the exact size of the candle base. That candle wasn't there before I left. Someone had brought it and put it somewhere else in the house. My whole body got goosebumps. I took the keys, ran out, and went straight to Zoe's apartment. Zoe opened the door scared, thinking that something serious had happened. I told everything quickly, and she made me sit down and breathe. We spent some time trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe some neighbor had a spare key, or the janitor had come in to solve something. I called the building administration, but the person in charge said that no one was authorized to enter my apartment that day, neither maintenance nor cleaning. And he reinforced that the master keys are stored in a locked closet on the ground floor. That made me even more restless. Zoe insisted that I sleep there that night, and I accepted. The next morning, we went back together to my apartment. As soon as I opened the door, the same sweet smell was there, even stronger. I went straight to the living room and saw another candle on the coffee table, just like the first one. The flame lit, the glass clean, no crack, the new wick. The air seemed dense, hot, and the low sound of a snap came from the melting wax. Zoe turned pale and retreated to the wall. I ran to erase, but when I approached, I noticed a difference. There was a round mark on the carpet, burned exactly where the first candle had been. That circle seemed recent, as if someone had lit another candle at the same point as the night before. I extinguished the candle with my trembling hand, trying to keep control. Zoe looked at me in silence, and for a moment none of us knew what to say. We decided to check all the locks and windows again, everything intact. No sign of forced entry, nothing out of place. Still, it was impossible to ignore the fact that someone had been there. I called the police, explained the situation, and asked them to send someone to check. While we waited, I sat on the couch and watched the candle pot. The glass still hot, the wick releasing that thin thread of smoke, and the sweet smell that now seemed sickening. The officers arrived about 20 minutes later. They looked around the entire apartment, looked at doors, backs, ceiling, even the ventilation system. Nothing. One of them asked if I had given someone a copy of the key, and when I said no, he just wrote it down in the report and told me to change the lock just in case. Before leaving, he commented that the smell was too strong for a single candle. After they closed the door, Zoe and I were silent. The air seemed heavy, hot, and when I looked at the pot again, I realized that the wick, which I had extinguished, was slightly lit again, a red ember shining alone.
Thank you for staying until the end of this video. It's amazing to have you here accompanying me until the end of the stories. If you liked it, leave your comment telling what was the story that moved you the most. And if you are not yet registered, sign up so you don't miss the next ones. Until next night of scary stories.